And I asked a question at that dinner, and I said to the assembled wisdom, what is the maximum feasible growth rate for India consistent with avoiding a resurgence of inflation and external financial trouble? Well, Dr. Manmohan Singh answered first and said 6%. Anything more than that would rekindle big problems. You said, Manmohan, too conservative, 7% we could maybe do. Your wife, Isher, said, you guys are way too conservative, we can make 8%. During this visit, the Prime Minister and you just now have confidently indicated, as in the past 5 years, 9% growth for India. What changed? What happened in that period to make possible sustained, stable 9% growth both past and prospectively when only a decade ago you were all thinking in much more modest terms?
No, it's like all good questions, you can only respond by giving a glib answer. I think two major things. One is, of course, experience. I mean, 9% is not something we haven't experienced. We experienced it for 5 years. And that makes you rethink maybe your whatever capital output ratios were too high earlier, et cetera, et cetera. If you go a little bit below that, one of the reasons for being very optimistic right now is that in the last 3 or 4 years, we've seen a massive increase in investment in India. I mean, the investment ratio has gone up to whatever, 39% or so in 2007, 2008. Some of that is stock building, but whatever way you do it, there's a big increase in investment as a ratio of GDP. And a lot of that, most of it, is actually an increase in private investment. So I think it's the judgment that the totality of economic policy changes has triggered a lot of dynamism in the private sector. Now, quite frankly, when the reforms were introduced, most of my friends who were skeptical about the reforms, they were not saying that, you know, reforms are not going to be good for the poor. They were saying reforms are going to be bad for the economy. You know, if you do this, the economy is going to collapse. The balance of payments is going to be thrown out of gear, etc. Now they say, well, yeah, they're good for growth, but what are they doing for the poor? And actually, a lot of the work that's being done shows that actually are filtering down to the poor, much more than people think. But that's not the same thing as saying there aren't tensions in terms of expectations. But there is a change, and the change really is that the potential for A, efficiency gains, and B, the response of the system in terms of savings and investment to the new policies is much greater than was. I mean, I would not have assumed that we would see investment rates of 39%. I mean, those were rates associated, I mean, in one time with China. China, of course, now is investing 65% of GDP, or saving 65% of GDP, but that's an outlier. If India can do something like 39% of investment, and I don't see any reason why it can't, particularly since I think the world will support a current-account deficit of 2.5% in order to let it do that, then, you know, on any calculation, we should be getting 9% of GDP. So that's the big change. I think it's also true that in the last 5 or 6 years, you know, the sense of self-confidence in the private sector and being able to cope with a global economy, show flexibility, be nimble, take advantage of opportunities, invest abroad, all of that has led to a very different perception of what the modern sector of the economy is capable of. And actually, there's also good news, in my view, on the rural areas. Because one of the things that our government consciously tried to do was to recognize that agricultural growth had been somewhat neglected earlier, and you needed a bit of refocusing on not just agriculture but rural infrastructure, because that takes care of both on-farm and off-farm economic activity in rural areas. And actually that has gone quite well. In fact, one of the reasons why, despite the slowdown, India has not been that much affected. I mean, part of the reason is that exports are not that big in relation to GDP. But the other really is that rural demand is held up quite well. In fact, when you talk to retailers and sort of the consumer goods manufacturers, they tell you that the slowing down they experienced was mainly in the metro cities. But in the tier 2 and the tier 2 cities, they didn't actually experience a slowing down of growth. So the basic model of a domestic demand-driven, supply-encouraged growth story is the answer to your question.
Just one follow-up question on that, Montek. I remember another dinner, this with then Finance Minister Chidambaran at Indra Nuyi's home up in New York, only about 5 years ago, when he said the constraint on our growth is our domestic saving rate, which can never get above 25%. Now it's 35.
Yep.
How did that happen?
Now, I need another glib answer. I really don't have an answer to that. I mean, but you know, it's something that's well worth subjecting to very detailed technical study. I'm not surprised that Chidambaram felt that at our income levels it wouldn't happen. Now, one factor, of course, is that quite a bit of it is corporate savings, okay? But it's not only corporate savings. I mean, a lot of it is also personal savings. So whether it's just the savings habit, this is sort of one of the Asian values that is often talked about, I don't know, but it's been a good story.
Montek, let me turn to another topic. The world economy, India's role in the world economy, obviously growing very rapidly. You are your government's G20 Sherpa. You've been much involved in the preparation for the subsequent G20 summits, including Pittsburgh here in the U.S. most recently. How do you see the G20, which now proclaims, with lots of support from around here at least, to become the steering committee for the world economy? It replaces the G7, 8, all that. Will it be effective in steering the world economy? What role for the emerging markets in that leadership structure? We read that the BRICS have their pre-G20 caucuses. What's all that about? And what role for India? So talk to us about this, I think, historic revolution in the global architecture, with the emerging markets now half the group, the Asians the big part within that. Talk to us about all that, how you see it evolving, how effective, and particularly India's role in it.
Well, yeah, I mean, you could argue in one sense that it's a logical outcome of what a lot of people, including you, have written about. Nevertheless, I think the credit does go to the Obama administration for actually deciding to make it the occasion of the Pittsburgh summit was used to say, right, the role of the principal forum, the premier forum for international economic discussions will not be the G8, but will be the G20. The G8 is not actually disbanded, it still exists. And probably in Canada, the G8 and the G20 meetings will still be kind of slightly back-to-back, though the Canadians tell me they're going to be in different places. So the G8 guys are going to go to Muskoka or somewhere, and then there's going to be a G20 somewhere else. So some of us have pointed out that wouldn't it be a good idea for the G8 to meet after the G20 to avoid the impression that a pre-cooked agenda is getting an imprimatur by the agenda. A lot of countries have concerns on this, not just developing countries. That may or may not happen, but certainly when the G20 meet in Korea, there won't be a G8. So that change is definitely there. I think you have to give credit to the G20 summit for really taking very bold and early steps to bring the financial crisis under control. Now, I think when these steps were taken, they were larger than what most people thought would be possible. In 2008, in April or wherever, in Horsham. And a question arises, I mean, the G20 at the finance ministers level always existed. Was it because the G20 were meeting at summit level that these decisions became possible? I personally think yes. I think if it had been left, I mean, the G20 at finance ministers level would not have been able to do this. So I think managing the crisis is something very much to the credit of the G20, and there were, I guess, three big points, big components of that. One was simply putting together the financing and maybe linking that with some vague notion of reform of the financial institutions, which had also been on the agenda for some time. But this sort of firmly gave near deadlines to that, and I think that they did extremely well on that score. Second was the whole business of financial regulation. How do you respond to the financial crisis by doing a pretty far-sighted, far-reaching reform of the financial regulatory system? I mean, regulatory reform shouldn't be done by heads of government, but they did give a very strong signal. And I think they created the institutional basis for a more democratic way of doing the reform by converting the Financial Stability Forum into the Financial Stability Board and broadened it to include membership of the G20. So the new financial regulatory structure that is going to emerge, the broad principles have already been enunciated. The details will all be worked out in the Financial Stability Board. That includes all the countries of the G20, which is not what used to happen earlier. So it forces the developing countries to make constructive suggestions in the process of building a consensus, rather than simply shooting from the sidelines, saying, oh, you guys have worked this out in Basel, but it doesn't apply to developing countries. And I think that one senses that even today. So I think that's a very important gain. Though now that the Financial Stability Forum board is there, I'm not sure that these things have to go back to the heads of government. I mean, I think they've created a system, and I think the finance ministers will be able to handle it quite well. The last, of course, was the whole issue of a forum where you can discuss whether the policies of individual countries are broadly consistent with what is said to be a global objective. I mean, in the limited case of current macro policies, it's the whole issue of the global demand imbalances, how are they going to be handled, et cetera, et cetera. Now, what they've put forward is sort of an agreement to have a framework in which there will be a kind of a peer review of policies of individual countries. The IMF will give advice to this group. I think it's a bit of an open question whether that arrangement can work very satisfactorily. Because I think it's in the essence of looking at these issues that there are very different perceptions. And actually what one wants to have is the different perceptions put on the table and everybody looking at them and then trying to find some sort of a way of balancing different points of view. In principle, the IMF could do that by preparing background papers in which they said, well, look, this is one kind of point of view, that's another kind of point of view, etc. But in practice, I'm not convinced that that can happen. I mean, a large, disciplined, bureaucratic now in a good sense, not in a bad sense, organization doesn't do that kind of thing. So they have a natural tendency to put forth a consensus position from which you're invited to dissent. So what the quality of that discussion will be is a bit of an open question. But it's an ambitious objective which the G20 has set. I mean, right now, for example, it boils down to saying that, I don't know what the nature of the discussions will be on things like the Chinese exchange rate, on what are the best instruments for rebalancing demand, which are the countries that should inflate and which are the countries that shouldn't. So in order to have a good discussion, the statements have to be, I think the term used in these communiques are candid. So we keep inviting the fund to give candid and frank assessments. But the moment any international organization sees the word candid and frank, it also knows that it's a minefield. So watch your step. So we'll have to see. But that is a new framework. And now the question is it going to be just done at the finance minister's level, or is it going to be done at heads of government level? And you know, my feeling is that when you have major issues, I don't think finance ministers are going to depart from what are established national positions. And that's really the role of the summit. It's not that, even in a summit, it's not that a head of government is going to suddenly change his country's position. But the fact is, engagement amongst these top people, and then when they go back and they have their own internal discussions, it will lead to a better appreciation of what the world's like. Now, a big constraint in this is how much comfort and ease is there amongst the heads of government. And that takes a long time to build up. I mean, it's quite clear in Pittsburgh, you know, where, I mean, the G8 were all on, you know, Barack and I say Gordon and that kind of term, whereas the other fellows are saying, you know, Mr. President and Mr. So-and-so. So you knew that frankness of interchange only comes after several meetings. But if it happens, I think it could contribute to a better, and certainly when you go beyond that and look at Doha, taking the hard decisions on, we finally got to come to a decision. I'm not sure that trade ministers can do it, left to themselves. So there will be that residual final political closure, perhaps can only be done at the head of government level on these issues.
Montek, let me segue from that to just one final question, then we'll open it to the group. Reform of the IMF itself. You headed the Independent Evaluation Office for 3 years. You know the fund intimately. Linking to what you just said, new assignments to the fund, obviously related to governance of the fund itself. What's your prescription and outlook for the fund? And I should say to the audience, you know it, what about the suggestion I recently made that the next managing director should be from an emerging market, and one very good candidate would be one Montek Ahluwalia from India. I'm volunteering to be his campaign chairman if he would like. But what about that as a reform, as part of the overall structure of IMF reform, and how does that get done? Does that require the heads of state at the G20?
I don't know whether Olivier Blanchard's discreet exit is designed to give me more flexibility in pronouncing it. I see Manmohan Kumar is there, so it's not as if the fund is not represented. No, I mean, obviously, it's been on the agenda for some time. I think Trevor Manuel's report had come out. There have been lots of things on the agenda. You know, I don't feel that, I mean, I thank you for your very supportive remarks about myself, but I'm not a candidate. However, the most important thing is not, I think, the individual, quite honestly, or the individual's nationality. In my view, whoever runs these organizations, there's a big difference between being nominated to run the organization and having emerged from some kind of a competitive process and obtained the consensus support in competition with others. So I personally don't think that the individuals will be that important. You know, on reform of the fund itself, it is a very important issue. My guess is that the single most obvious reform that is needed in the fund is to eliminate the grotesquely kind of exaggerated representation of Europeans on the board. I mean, it's not possible to increase any representation without taking care of this. Otherwise, you're going to end up with a fund board of 25, 30, whatever, some ridiculous number. Now, quite frankly, you know, I don't see much willingness to do that. I mean, personally, I think it's not even worth wasting energy in fund reform except in a two-stage process. I mean, first, you decide that VAT is acceptable. This is actually a gift which the industrialized countries can give without having the developing countries squabbling for it. The moment you do that, then I think people will be very serious about all kinds of other reforms. Otherwise, it'll go back to the same board. And what's going to happen, you know, the rumor had it, I don't know for a fact, but In the G20, in the Sherpas, there was some talk at one time that the Trevor Manuel report would go up to the IMFC. But of course, it didn't go up to the IMFC because the fund board said, no, it can only go to the IMFC once it's been discussed in the fund board. So I think you need a two-stage reform. You need to develop the consensus needed for the European shares to shrink, and that would enable others to come in. And in exchange for that, you could then get a lot of very active thinking on reform. I mean, the notion that the heads of these institutions should be competitively chosen without predetermination of national quotas, that's already a done deal. I mean, the G20 have endorsed what was widely expected to be the right thing to do.
Okay, the floor is open, and we'll go around and get lots of different questions right here. Then we've got a standing mic in the back for those who are toward the end, and a traveling mic right here. Please identify yourself and then fire away.
Mr. Chairman, Wolf Gross of Northrop Grumman International. You mentioned in passing somewhat the tragic events of just a year ago tomorrow. The New York Times this morning had a what I would characterize as an uncharitable description of the efforts of the government of India to ameliorate the situation that existed then with respect to security. My management looks at an article like that and says the government of India hasn't done enough to improve security. Why should we invest under FDI or other circumstances in the Indian economy? Now, this is right up your alley, and I wanted to see what your comments would be connecting security with foreign direct investment. Thank you.
I think, no, clearly they are connected, and as a matter of fact, the same question was raised in a somewhat different way at the press conference, and I can only, of the Prime Minister, and I can only repeat what he said, that, it is not true that we're not doing anything on security. There's a very extensive review that's been undertaken. We have an extremely dynamic minister now in charge of it, Mr. Chidambaram, who was our finance minister earlier. We have a very, very active collaboration with the US side on what needs to be done, intelligence sharing, et cetera, et cetera. So if you want an assurance, I'm personally quite satisfied that this is something that the government is paying the highest amount of attention to, and is, from a technical point of view, we're very much dealing with it in the best way possible. But isolated, there's no, terrorism is not a threat only to India or to Mumbai. It's a threat everywhere. So it's not, in my view, I don't think it would be fair to say that India is singled out. We're all vulnerable to it. We all have to wake up to it. We all have to cooperate and collaborate. And time will tell how effective we are in doing that.
Jessica.
Hi, Jessica Einhorn Science, and thank you for those remarks. I'm glad you didn't follow Fred's advice. It was very interesting. Question, Montek. A lot has changed in this city and around, and it's largely about ideas, actually, more than architecture. So there's been some fundamental changes, and probably two of the most important are on asset price inflation, both as regulatory policy, but also as monetary policy. And also, I think it's the first time in many decades that a managing director of the IMF spoke out about the possibility that capital controls could, in fact, be a wise policy, though he doubted their effectiveness over the long term, for a different kind of asset price inflation, which was money pouring in on an exchange rate. So I was wondering, with all your experience, but also with India's stock market having gone up as much as it did in the last year, if you could share with us your views and an Indian perspective on those two questions of asset price inflation and not a freewheeling capital control, but a capital control approach when there are herd-like instincts that are affecting asset prices through the exchange rate mechanism?
Well, on the issue of asset pricing, I don't have anything to add to what everybody now regards as something we ought to worry about. And I think it's ultimately something which central banks have to take into account, whether as part of the signaling of inflationary pressures, etc., they would worry about asset price inflation, even if the usual headline inflation numbers do not signal a problem. My short guess would be that, of course, you must worry about it, but in practice, it's very difficult to tell when you're really getting into an asset price bubble situation. But a lot of the regulatory tinkering, or rather the structure that people are evolving, is simply designed to at least build in some buffers. So when it looks like there's a lot of asset price inflation, you do a little bit of countering, and there are many ways of doing it, and I'm sure that this is going to be handled by very competent people. I don't worry about it too much because I think for the next 2 years, we don't have to worry about it. Right now, we can't get the banks to lend. That's true. I mean, Secretary Clinton was telling me, I was complaining about the fact that our banks are not lending, although they're very secure. And she was telling me that's exactly the perception that exists in this country. So for the next 2 years, I don't think we have to worry about an asset price bubble. Capital inflows, yes. To some extent, what we see now as a surge of inflows is only a return to normal. I mean, I forget the exact numbers, but I think in 2007 or something, we had about $100 billion of money coming in, most of which was added to reserves. We don't need to go back to 100 billion. We can manage for our current needs with even half of that or less than half of that. What you're seeing is just a return of the money that got pulled away in the so-called flight to quality. Mind you, that term flight to quality is a bit kind of peculiar under the circumstances, but ignoring that, we're glad that it's correcting itself. Should we be worried about whether you might have such flows in future, and what should we do about it? The answer, this is one of the things where, this group that has been set up for peer review would look at what are the possibilities. I'm not satisfied, by the way, that anybody has a particularly clever way of doing it. I don't believe that putting a little tax on capital flows will make any difference. In the sense that it may make a lot of difference from the point of view of revenue. But, if you're faced with if you think that the renminbi is going to appreciate by 25%, I don't see that a 1% tax is going to deter anybody. Then you get into the business of having a tax that you keep varying. And that's a recipe for disaster, because, how wise the people will be who will start calibrating it. And so I'm not a great supporter. I have no problem whatsoever if somebody thinks that a Tobin tax is a good way of raising money. Not that it's going to be moderating the flows all that much. Raising money, yeah, if you think it's a good idea, but personally there are many other ways of raising the money which have more or less the same impact. So, and we discussed this in some of the meetings we had. There are lots of different ideas. Tax on transactions, a tax on all financial transactions, not just capital flows, but all domestic. That's another idea. A tax on financial assets is a third idea. But I think we wait for the IMF working paper, which will no doubt lay out what different countries are doing and make recommendations. But I wouldn't hold my breath to think of very innovative things being done here. There isn't at the moment the kind of surge that is causing any immense problems to anybody. The big exchange rate misalignments are not the ones caused by the surge. They're very obvious, and how they're going to be handled is a much bigger challenge for the world economy than worrying about what capital flows might do. But, this is the answer for the next 2 years. When we're growing at 9% again, I think somebody ought to be doing some work on the issues you raised.
Arvind, Montek took your name in vain earlier, so you get a chance to come back.
Montek, I was just wondering one question. You know, when people say, what is the Indian government doing in terms of reform, why is it that we don't emphasize enough the fact that actually in one area we're doing a hell of a lot, which is trade liberalization. It's not of the purest Jagdish Bhagwati sort, but we're really embarking on, you know, really a huge amount of preferential trade agreements, which ultimately are bringing around tariffs, you know, all over Asia, perhaps with Europe, perhaps even with Canada. So that's a kind of undersold part of the story. And A, do you agree with that? And B, do you think we're going to see more of that?
Well, you know, if you believe that asserting that will make people think we're doing reforms, I will certainly take note of it and use it. We've consistently believed, by the way, that real trade liberalization is, of course, multilateral. And there's quite a deep belief in India, and therefore the sadness at the Doha round not getting anywhere. But it's true that in our particular circumstances, the free trade arrangement with the ASEAN, which has been signed, I mean, creates a political commitment to integrate, which has a sort of a mind-changing aspect, which will make it possible to do more multilateral trade liberalization. I've always believed that the real value of the regional free trade agreements is that they get rid of the sort of people who believe that if you raise barriers is good for the economy. Because if you've done this, then multilateralizing them is a relatively easy argument to make. So, and I think most people in India, at least government people, take that view. But you're right that I think the free trade agreements that we have signed, we do think will cement the commitment to remaining open. And it would be very easy for us to lower the distortionary impact of these arrangements simply by lowering our tariffs.
Or negotiating more of these agreements.
Yeah, well, that's also possible, yeah.
Montek, just to follow up on that, and to follow up a bit an exchange I had with the Prime Minister on Monday, as you know. Suppose, to follow up Arvind's question, suppose you successfully work out trade agreements with all the parties with whom you're now negotiating. In addition to ASEAN, it's Korea, you already have, the EU, Japan, Canada, maybe a few others. Then you would have preferential trade agreements with all major trading entities in the world, with one exception, the United States. So the result would be a lot of discrimination against the United States in favor of most of the rest of the world's trading powers with India. How do you reconcile that?
But I think you extracted from the Prime Minister an assertion that in the circumstances he was also in favor of considering a free trade agreement with the US. And you know, I think it's certainly true that if a country has a number of free trade agreements, and it also says, as we do always say, that we believe that multilateral liberalization is what we want, then it is illogical to exclude anyone who wants a free trade agreement. Now, first of all, it is not India's perception that the US wants a free trade agreement. The current perception is that basically if you mention free trade agreement, that's the end of the conversation, and maybe the friendship, so nobody mentions it in official discussion. But yeah, I mean, it's not something that cannot be raised. I think there'll be obvious areas of sensitivity. I mean, number one, the US heavily subsidizes its agriculture. So the immediate demand on the Indian side would be that let's have a free trade agreement excluding agriculture, because your agriculture is heavily. So the usual Indian wisecrack is that our farmers can compete with your farmers but not with the US Treasury. And that's a reasonable position. Then you'll come to a slightly more set of symmetric differences, which would be on services. I mean, the US would make certain demands, which perhaps from the Indian side may not be immediately acceptable, but equally the Indians would make demands which from the US side would not be acceptable. Actually, in my view, an intellectual examination of the case for a free trade agreement with a very clear indication of what the nature of these problems would be is quite useful.
Well, I would pledge that the Institute will in fact not pursue a study of exactly that type, hoping to pave the way for the kind of future discussion between our governments. My editorial comment would be that whatever the view of the U.S. government today, neither it nor the Congress will be able to ignore the fact that a huge trading partner like India will have deals with everybody else that hurt the United States. The logic of letting that persist is rather clear, and I suspect will evolve over a couple of years. And if we can help pave the way for that with a serious analysis of the type you call for, we will certainly try to contribute that. Okay, other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Hello, Jeanette Kennedy with Nokia. Thank you, Dr. Ahluwalia and Mr. Bergston. Mike, I'd like to go back to your comments on domestic consumption and taxes. We are aware that there is a GST increase taking effect in April next year, and for us, that would create an effective tax rate on our products from 5% to 18%. And when you state that the growth in the second and third tier markets are going to be some of the drivers of the growth of the Indian economy, this tax is something that we see would start to affect those levels of growth, particularly in IT, as it's one of the biggest growth sectors in the Indian economy. A related issue is the increase in gray market and illegal products in the Indian market. And so 2 questions is, number one, what are the principles that the Indian government is looking at where they're trying to balance domestic consumption with, increasing FDI and continued FDI? Companies like ours will continue to invest there. And 2, how do you address gray market issues? There are neighboring countries to India that at certain levels of government feel that economic growth is economic growth, and the activity is fine, regardless if it's legal. I wondered if you could comment on that in terms of how it affects Indian economy.
But on the GST, your concern was they would differentially hurt some products. Was that what you said? The agricultural products.
No, for IT products. For IT products, specifically on handsets.
Okay.
Yeah, the local manufacturer, effectively the tax on that is 5%, and once the GST takes effect, it would effectively be 18%.
She's from Nokia.
Well, this is a difficult question in the sense that we've got a set of tax rates where at different times different groups had slightly preferential taxes and all the rest of it. So you have multiple rates of tax. The introduction of a GST is clearly a major indirect tax reform, which will integrate both the national level tax and the state level tax and allow for set-offs, etc. In order to make it feasible, you need to reduce the multiplicity of taxes. So by definition, if you reduce the multiplicity of taxes, some products will get taxed less and some products will get taxed more. I would only suggest that the global efficiency impact of that will probably swamp any kind of micro impact, although no company ever accepts that argument when you make it to them. And in the end, indirect taxes, in my view, are borne by the consumer. So just pass it on, and if these guys don't worry. Otherwise indirect tax reform is impossible. Really, I think the bottom line is that the economy will become more efficient. It will create more jobs, more income, more growth. We'll be getting rid of inter-product differentiation, and I don't think that over a period of 2 years or 3 years, nobody will, hanker for the earlier regime where you got a slightly better tax rate. Now, it is true that for certain products, which are, I don't know, pharmaceuticals, essential drugs, and so on, where the low taxation is quite clearly seen to be a kind of a merit issue, I'm sure they will be having a category. But I'm just hoping that not everybody will want to get into that category. But you're welcome to try if you can get away with it.
Okay, more hands. Steve. Over here.
Thank you, Steve Wiseman here at the Institute. I wonder if you might come back to the rural development issue where the poverty is concentrated in parts of northern India. And the experience of this growth that India has enjoyed over the last couple of decades and accelerated recently, how has that changed your strategy and the sense of urgency that you might have about putting resources in the poorest areas and how to do that best?
You know, I mean, obviously this is you can get whatever answer you want depending on which study you look at. But I would say that in the last few years, I think there's been an academic shift in the assessment on whether the growth process that has been unleashed is actually more or less poverty reducing. There was a very strong perception amongst critics that having conceded that these guys know how to get growth, which was a big concession, wasn't made for 10 years, everybody piled on to the attack that, yeah, they may have got growth, but they've completely screwed up the income distribution, poverty, etc. And that therefore this growth was somehow less poverty reducing. I saw some stuff by, I think, Martin Ravalian and Gaurav Dutt, who've done a lot of work on this, and some of their work at certain times appeared to endorse the other position, but the most recent paper that they've produced quite categorically comes out saying that it looks as if the most recent, the recent growth that you've seen is certainly not less poverty reducing, could be more poverty reducing, but they're not sure about that. So the notion that, you know, somehow this growth process is missing out on the poor, I don't think is actually borne out. This is not to say, by the way, that in some district or some part of some state this may not be happening. After all, we're talking about a very, very large economy geographically with a lot of differentiation. You know, another study that I've seen, which is going to be published very shortly, and actually I think you ought to get, if there's interest in that, Devesh Kapoor at Kasi, the Center for Advanced Study of India, has been mentoring a very interesting survey done in Uttar Pradesh, looking at whether since 1991, or I mean over the last 10 years perhaps, what has been the impact of economic growth on the lives of the Dalits, the former scheduled castes, so to speak, the poorest of the poor. And it's based on a survey of 19,000 households, so it's not a small kind of little study, in 2 districts of Uttar Pradesh, one in western Uttar Pradesh and one in eastern Uttar Pradesh. Western Uttar Pradesh is more agriculturally prosperous, eastern Uttar Pradesh less so. And unambiguously, what this study finds is that the conditions of living of the Dalits, and this is for the district, it's a huge selection. In fact, it's virtually a census for the particular villages they've chosen. Unambiguously, there is an improvement a significant improvement in the levels of living. One of the interesting findings in it, by the way, is that the improvement is greater in eastern UP than western UP, although western UP is agriculturally more prosperous. And the reason in eastern UP there's a lot of migration, and the role of migration in and the migration to other parts of the country and the remittance back is making quite a difference to people's lives. Even more than that is the difference that it's making to status and the sort of erosion of caste because of the growth of caste-neutral activities. So it's quite, I think there's a lot of accumulation of evidence which would suggest that the proposition that this growth is bypassing the poor is simply not true. This is not, by the way, inconsistent with saying that people are far more demanding and they feel that what is happening is not good enough. Because it's not removing, it's not necessarily reducing the gaps. And the political process, on the other hand, is hugely enhancing, and good for it, enhancing expectations. So one can well imagine that you're seeing a process of structural change where empowerment is going up more rapidly than incomes are increasing. The perception of what is possible is expanding madly, and the system is under immense pressure to deliver. And in some degrees, the level of dissatisfaction may also have increased. But it's not a dissatisfaction of a despairing kind. It's an anger that, look, you better let me have my rights, otherwise I'm going to do something about it. Which, to my mind, is a positive development in the society. Now, this may be putting too much of guilt on it, but you know, I like to believe, since I live there, that this is really what is happening. And I'm really pleased that some of the latest results, thoughtful studies, are demonstrating that. You should ask, I don't think they have it on their website, but the Center for Advanced Study of India, they're certainly going around making PowerPoint presentations, and I think you should get one of them to come here and do that.
Good idea. All right, we've got two last questions over here at this table. Jan, and then your neighbor.
Allow me to take you to task on something you said.
Please introduce.
Oh, I'm sorry, Jan Boyer. I'm an investor in the energy sector. Allow me to take you to task for something you said. And 5 years ago, I was a guest in your home in Delhi. There was 2 economists there. Actually, I'm going to take you to task for something you said today, not 5 years ago, the way Fred did, and I probably wouldn't be as good as chastising you as he was. With what you said today about your characterization as long-term challenges, and you mentioned infrastructure, and then you mentioned energy. And what I wanted to ask is, the availability and price of energy in India today is a huge constraint to many things. Poverty alleviation, but also growth. And if we have seen sort of examples, and I know you mentioned infrastructure and private-public partnerships, but all those things haven't been very successful, at least here in the United States and some other countries, more or less. But as you look at the challenge of energy and you think of, for instance, what has happened in the cellular business, I describe that as a leapfrogging. Why does the development of energy resources, assets, of the traditional energy variety, of the renewable, clean technology, need to take this path that you referred to as sort of long-term challenges over time, learn best practices, rather than thinking more in leapfrogging terms, both from a technology point of view, from an investment point of view, from creating the incentives? So, Mr. Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission, what are you planning to do on that front? Thank you.
No, by the way, I agree with what, we do need to do a lot more thinking on the incentivization, on the leapfrogging, on the technology, etc. You know, my impression is, when you said cellular, I take it you meant cellular phones.
Right.
Yeah. Now, you know, everybody compares cellular phones, and why can't every other infrastructure be like that? And I mean, the short answer is that the technological change there was dramatic. I mean, here you had a situation where there was new technology came in that cut costs by a factor of whatever, 10 or something like that. And I mean, it's relatively easy to organize a change which is going to allow a new technology to come in, which is going to be a dramatically cost-cutting technology, because everyone's so happy. I'm sure we didn't do it ideally, we should have done it better, etc., but in the end, an enormous number of people have telephones, and they're all very happy, and the prices have come down. Now, while there is technology in electricity, it's not the kind of technology that is dramatically reducing costs. A lot of it is dramatically improving efficiency. I mean, the whole smart grids kind of range of issues. A lot of it requires regulatory action to support, like, for example, enforcing variations in time of day tariffs. It's more complex, I think. And I mean, there's no doubt that we ought to be doing a lot more of it. And when you say, what are we planning? We're always planning things, so we are planning this. But I think, unlike telephones, where, I mean, it was relatively easy in telephones to break the state monopoly on landlines, partly because the state never believed, the state monopolists never believed that they were going to be outcompeted, that nobody would care about a landline telephone anymore. And therefore there wasn't much resistance. And the other thing is that the cellular phones, really dramatic reduction in cost. I don't think we have a similar situation in electricity. But I can tell you that you're right in saying that we need to do more of this kind of experimenting, and some of it is starting. I mean, for example, there seems to be a political resistance to privatizing distribution in electricity, but they're overcoming it by franchising out bits of the system to someone. And the first few efforts at doing that have led to dramatic improvements in efficiency. But they're not for the whole state, it's for one town. And now you're getting more towns getting into the act. So I think in a typically Indian way, when these things become too evident, resistance to them will also break down. But I agree with you that we should be doing a lot more in that area than we are. We are on the technology front, by the way, driven largely by climate change type concerns, trying to go in for more efficient systems, supercritical thermal plants, all of which reduces carbon use and so forth. So the focus at the moment is on that. The most important thing would be to bring the focus in onto distribution and better technology in distribution, which I think there is a lot of scope for.
Okay, final question.
Thank you, Fred. I'm Shuja Nawaz from the Atlantic Council. I have a question about the region, and this partly takes off from John's point, India's great demand for energy. Clearly, if there were more regional integration, and if borders were to open up, particularly to the West and to Central Asia, a lot of those demands for energy could be met much more effectively and efficiently than purely from internal sources. What do you think is the possibility of economics taking the lead rather than politics taking the lead in opening up that kind of regional integration? And what role can India play as the biggest economy and political power in the region in that regard?
Well, I think we should certainly do more, and I completely agree that from the economic point of view, there's no question that there ought to be greater regional optimization of what is possible. It is true that the politics of South Asia has not been the happiest, and that has undoubtedly sort of led to much less of this kind of activity than would otherwise happen. However, in India, just because of the absolute size of the economy, the present position is that we haven't got an adequate integration of the regional grids in India. So there's a lot to be done internally, which would generate efficiencies, linking up surpluses available in one part of the country with demand in another part of the country by improving transmission capacity and so on. But in principle, I have absolutely no doubt whatsoever that we ought to be doing this regionally. And certainly with our smaller neighbors to the north, I mean, certainly with Bhutan, we're very keenly doing this sort of hydro development and buyback of electricity. More difficult, we're very keen to do that in Nepal also. Nepal has its own kind of political dynamic at the moment. And they tend to view this somehow as having to bear environmental costs in order to sell electricity across the border. It could be that maybe you need to offer a better price. And as the price of electricity goes up and our own options in terms of hydroelectricity get exhausted, maybe it will be easier to persuade them to do that. Certainly in the case of gas with Bangladesh, there's a very strong case. There I think the resistance lies in Bangladesh, because they don't want to export the gas. They want to process the gas domestically, which is in many countries. So we've often said, well, look, we'll go and build fertilizer plants there and then import the fertilizer. So I think politics has sort of been an impediment to as much economic integration as could otherwise take place. But I'm certainly hoping, I mean, India can obviously, being the larger economy or the largest economy in that region, India has more potential to take initiatives, and I would be in favor of those initiatives, really.
Montek, let me ask one final question that follows up to that. You talked earlier about the global economic architecture. Now you've just addressed at least a part of the subcontinent architecture. What about the architecture of Asia as a whole? There's a lot of discussion in East Asia, ASEAN +3, ASEAN +6, that would bring in India, recent APEC summit, Asia-Pacific architecture and efforts to get that going again with the Trans-Pacific Partnership. How do you say, and you've had a go east policy, of course, in India, and you've actively negotiated with ASEAN, as you were saying earlier. What's your view of the coming changes in the Asian architecture? Do you see it in any sense as competition between India and China? What's your position and posture toward that evolution over the next few years?
Well, I mean, my view on of course there's competition between everybody and everybody, and since among the emerging market economies, China is larger than India, but India is the second largest. There should be competition between them, but I mean in the same sense that there is competition between Europe and America. I mean, our view on this is that a properly managed world should provide enough room for both India and China to achieve their ambitions. It will impose a lot of discipline on them as they compete for scarce resources. But they're not the only ones competing for those scarce resources. There's everybody else too. So I don't think the India-China, we have never put ourselves in a position where we want people to be saying India versus China or India or China. I think we've always said India and China, and that's fair enough. Architecture is irrelevant. I mean, we are in favor of as open an Asian architecture as possible. So obviously we are in favor of ASEAN +6. But, you know, I don't know how that will evolve, quite honestly. I mean, beyond the point, I mean, since Asia accounts for a huge amount of the growth in the world, you might as well talk of a global architecture, because you're not really, the region is becoming sufficiently broadly defined. And if you look across the Pacific, there's the United States. So, but ASEAN +6 is certainly something that we've been in favor of, if you're thinking just of the Asian architecture.
Okay, Montek, you've done fantastic service to your country for many years and decades. You've done fantastic contributing to the world economy. You've got lots more ahead of you, whether or not you decide to run for managing director of the IMF with my more or less assistance. We thank you very much for your presentation today. Thanks again to Ambassador Shankar for helping tee this up, being here today. Thank you all for coming.